The 43rd chapter of Isaiah, the second verse. The 43rd chapter of Isaiah and the second verse. And as you turn to that again, when I think about all of the great giants that we've lost, Coretta Scott King and William Augustus Jones, many of y'all, I'm sure, know Dr. Jones out in New York. Reminds me of a saying that I heard in the Southern Baptist circles about a minister, Carlisle Marney, when they said he had a voice like God's, only deeper. And when you think about all those great giants, to be sitting in the presence of these giants back here, I know y'all appreciate Dr. Richardson, Dean Richardson, and Dean Crawford, but I think you ought to rise to your feet just to say thank you to them for what they are and what they continue to do. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. I want to reflect quite briefly this morning on the subject, come hell or high water. When I think about what happened recently on 8/29, which as a marker of meaningful transition to more profound awareness as a nation and people, rivals 9/11 without need for the addendum of a year. It reigns in my own mind with 9/11 for African American people in particular, but the nation more broadly, as a significant marker. 8/29, August 29th, 2005, when the vicious winds and violent waters of Hurricane Katrina were visited upon the Gulf Coast. The tragedy of that natural disaster was compounded by the unnatural disasters that we saw revealed that day and indeed that week. Excuse me. And what we saw revealed that day and week were lamentable signs of our failure to love our vulnerable brothers and sisters. That hurricane, whose category has been debated, whether it was really 3 or 4, in any case it was horrendous, visited its vicious intensity upon vulnerable populations who had not been protected by either government or, some argued, even God. Indeed, some people suggested God sent that storm to punish people because they were gay or because they were black and poor and addicted to welfare. I heard this on television. Or because they studied Vodun or voodoo, but they didn't appreciate Vodun and its intricate religious practices and its African origins, or either its black diasporic consequences or iterations. It was the Edgar Rice Burroughs school of Tarzan providing the prism for voodoo. That God would dare erase this city from memory because God was fed up with the sin of New Orleans. And then one wonders, has God lost God's eyesight? If the reasons exist in the divine mind for the purposes that people ascribe to them. I'll say more about that in a minute. And so when that tragedy occurred, when that hurricane blew, it blew off the cover of the American government and the American people because we abandoned those poor black and white people for 5 days in a country that possesses so much richness and so much wealth. And beyond that, for a country that prides itself upon helping everybody else, folk throughout the world, when there's a fire, we want to put it out. When there's a war to be fought, we want to start it. And yet that nostrum, that saying, that cliche, which is a condensation of wisdom, a distillation of ethnic practice of the race, the human race, a cliche that suggested that charity begins at home. That charity, which is love really, because charity full-blown is justice publicly articulated. After all, justice is what love sounds like when it speaks in public. And charity begins at home. That's why generosity can never be a substitute for justice. Charity is an episode of kindness directed toward an object of recipients. A recipient, an object or a recipient, but justice is the structural perpetuation of the initial intent of generosity. See, charity, and in that sense, giving, is an episode of righteous intervention, whereas justice is a structural continuation of the very ideals for which charity exists. That's why Martin Luther King Jr. said that you just can't flip a coin to a beggar on the Jericho road. You just can't help that poor brother or sister out. You got to begin to ask the bigger question: why is it that there are people beaten up on the Jericho road? King said you got to transform the Jericho road itself. And when you transform the Jericho road, that's justice. When you help the beggar out on the road, that's charity. You got to move towards something long term. You got to ask the question, why is it in those neighborhoods people tend to be undereducated? To just give money to those kids is charity. To figure out why those schools are failing and to fix them is justice. It's charity to give money to somebody who's homeless on the street. It's justice to try to fix the housing problem in a particular city and the economic inequality and the wage injustice that leads people to be homeless in the first place. See, because with charity, you can run out of feeling good about me. In fact, you just get plain tired of me. You know how it is. Look, I done gave you everything I'm going to give you now. Don't be asking me for nothing else. And so when you give charity, it's an episode of generosity. It is not, even though predicated upon the most benign of intents, indeed the most valuable motivations, it does not ultimately answer or address the fundamental issue at hand. And that is, how can we move beyond what we feel about something to acting upon what we know to be the truth of the situation? That's why people got Katrina fatigue. That's why people got compassion fatigue, because we get tired of giving when it's based upon our generosity. People are already tired about Katrina. That's why I tried to write this book so fast, because I knew they was going to forget. I knew they were going to forget. Let me phrase that correctly. I am at Howard. I knew they was going to forget. And they were going to forget because amnesia's seductions are everywhere. The ability to engage in dangerous memory, counteracting the intuition that people generate as a result of social practice. And when we see it time and time again, the reality is we really just don't care about poor people. See, they just don't matter that much. We don't care about poor white rural Southern people. We see what happens in the Sago mines in West Virginia, and we get all exercised and outraged for a minute. How terrible those people were treated, we say, how awful. And then we keep up with the one surviving miner who lived, and we look at his progress medically on CNN, but beyond that, we ain't got much real serious care. And then we see that when they were fined, the mine owners that led to the death of 12 miners, they received a fine that was less than the fine levied against CBS for Janet Jackson's Nipplegate. Now that's a mixed up thing right there. If I had time, I could just deconstruct that. One black titty is so rebellious and revolutionary when it's unleashed and uncupped that it will send America into conniptions. That African aureola that I know is powerful, I just didn't know the world knew it was that powerful. There, a greater fine was levied against CBS. How dare they, is the implication, engage in the outlawed and transgressive black female sexuality. Because whenever black female sexuality even attempts to get in control of its own means, that's really the problem. Right, and I ain't trying to elevate Janet Jackson as no feminist in a post-feminist world. I'm not trying to argue that. I'm just saying even when the prospect of black intimacy and erotic engagement gets to defend itself in public and not be exploited by either black men in rap videos or white men throughout history. Don't start with Snoop. Got to go back to the plantation overseer too. Right? Don't start with T.I., start with T.J., Thomas Jefferson. Snuck up into them slave quarters. Despite being suspicious and skeptical of the critical capacity of reason for the Negro. Didn't stop him from getting down deep into that black aureola of Sally Hemings and partnering with her to produce an issue that contradicted his own radical racist principle. That's what black women would do for you. Even when you convince we inferior, they're gonna make you understand that your notion of their inferiority is subordinate to your desire to get to the heart of their mystery. Man. And so we don't really care about poor white Southern rural people. And if we don't care about poor white Southern rural people, we care even less about black, poor Southern people. This was, after all, a Southern racial narrative playing out on a global landscape. Mr. Bush, Texas bred and born, Michael Brown, head then of FEMA from Oklahoma, and those black people down in Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi. It's a Southern racial narrative being exegeted, torn apart as a text by the interpreters of our national narrative. And on the TV, they were priests trying to get at the church of confusion while they're trying to deconstruct the understanding that the nation was putting forth. They failed us in a miserable fashion, and even those interpreters who were lodged in the government had no understanding of just how fundamental a revelation of our moral bankruptcy this particular episode was. And so here we are seeing a Southern racial narrative play itself out on a global landscape. And we saw it in the midst of a culture that claimed to be so sensitive and compassionate that it was willing to save Iraqi wetlands. Mr. Bush himself engaging in preemption as an interesting response to a threat. You saw at Coretta Scott King's funeral that Mr. Lowry, in poetic form, advised the president wasn't no weapons of mass destruction. And you know, folk went off on him and off on the funeral in general. I heard and read Mary Magdalene, on whose show I've appeared on CNN, on Crossfire. I got love and respect for her, even though I ideologically oppose her tooth and nail. Love her husband Mo in terms of his politics, Brother Carville. But here she is saying that funeral, it was just un-Southern and un-Christian for these black people to politicize Coretta Scott King's funeral. I was at the funeral. The bottom line is, when you come to a black funeral for somebody like that, it ain't against principle to talk about the stuff they live for. When you come to my funeral, say a few things about me, but then rock it. In fact, you can have a voter registration drive in my funeral. Oh, I'm serious about that. Huh? And while they let me down in the ground, you rise up on the truth for which I live. So let some hip-hoppers rock it up in there. Let some preachers rock it up in there. Talk about social injustice. Talk about homophobia. Talk about misogyny. Talk about sexism. Talk about white supremacy. Honor the life I live by talking about what I was willing to die for. That ain't no politicization. That's an acknowledgement of the truth of the gospel. And so the text in Isaiah is just a Baptist preacher, says that when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Those folk had been through waters long before Katrina descended. Who were these people on television we saw, and why were they invisible for so long? Why was America so amazed that people could be poor? We ain't amazed. But the reason we were able to have some sense of moral outrage is because for once we thought it didn't implicate us. It was the local government, the state government, the federal government. But the moment you internalize a bootstrap mentality that says people get what they deserve, you contributing to Katrina. The moment you believe that those people basically were lazy and dumb, and after all, if you say Shaniqua, Taliqua, and all of them have not lived up to their end of the bargain, you basically thought those people got what they deserved. If you're going to be consistent in your ideological approach and your political commitment and the consequences of your social analysis. So the reality is, a lot of us contributed to the belief that held in place the upward mobility of people because of structural barriers to their success economically and financially. A lot of us contributed metaphysically, metaphorically, symbolically, theologically to keeping them in check and holding them in place. Because you see, we say that people should work. Do you know most poor people are working people? Most poor people work every day. They are part of what we know as the contingent and the battalion of the working poor, working 40 and 50 and 60 hours a week. And so the waters came down and they were vulnerable. And you see, in Mississippi is the poorest state in the nation. Louisiana is second to it. Alabama ain't that far behind. And so, my brothers and sisters, 134,000 people in New Orleans alone did not own cars. They weren't stubborn, they weren't stupid, they were stuck. Those of us who have cars can't imagine that. Those of us who got great transportation, public transportation, don't know that. But you see, the mayor let the buses drown. Mayor Nagin has been remade as a black folk hero. Slow down. They called him Ray Reagan because of his Republican pedigree. That don't make him bad. I'm just trying to specify the ideological apparatus through which he articulated his own political vision. Right? Cross party lines to vote against Kathleen Babino Blanco, right? The Democratic, right, governor, he sided with the Republican opponent to her. Cool, we just want to specify. So when the head of the National Weather Service called Mayor Nagin up, Isaiah says, in the midst of the waters, when he called the governor, when he called the mayor up and said, this is the worst storm I've ever seen, the head of the National Weather Service, one of the few government agencies that responded admirably during the crisis, he said, I want to go to bed with a good conscience because these people will die. He told him that at 6 o'clock, and Mayor Nagin said it scared the crap out of him, but did not sufficiently motivate him to move toward a mandatory evacuation to the next morning at 10 a.m. What happened in the interim? He consulted the business community because he didn't want to be legally liable. Now, I'm telling you, Kanye West got to extend the question to Nagin. Nearly 1,000 seats on an Amtrak train were let go free from New Orleans to Mississippi because the mayor said we don't need them. And then those buses drowned. So I'll tell you, my brothers and sisters, it's a tricky affair where race and class converge. Because then we divide ourselves not simply in terms of pigment, but in terms of class structure. Because them po niggas just don't really count the same way. We don't want to say it. It's a horrible word to even suggest that they would be the N word. No, they're niggas because they get left behind. Malcolm X, whose 81st birthday is this year, and we just finished celebrating the 41st anniversary, or at least marking it, of his death, talked about the specific definition of a nigger who was vulnerable. He said, you are, as a nigger, a victim of democracy. Mr. Bush should hear that. A victim of democracy. Democracy itself is not sufficient to organize the logic of justice. He says, we are victims of democracy. And so these, in that sense, these poor, vulnerable black people did not count as much to the black folk who are in charge. And so in the waters, Isaiah says that I will be with you, and yet there in the waters, that toxic stew, that's a petrochemical corridor from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, y'all, that 85, 90 miles, those fence-lined communities along the Mississippi River where there's more than 120 some odd chemical plants. That's why they call it Cancer Alley. They're dying, they're underemployed, they're unemployed, they're low-wage workers. And these are the people we went down to New Orleans, not like these 200 students going down there to help somebody. We went down there to party. We went down there in the anonymity of our Christian identity to escape the demands of its more visible and certifiable consequences. We went down there to creep, to escape. Went down there to gamble a little bit. Some of us who believe in gambling. But we gambled more with their lives than going to the casinos. We drank, we ate crawdad and crawfish, we scrimps. Those poor black people were there changing our bed sheets, changing the soiled linen that were the marks of our desire and failure, changing our sheets and then driving us around. And did we tip them? Did we give them money? Generosity. But we never asked the question about why they were so poor. Structure, justice. These are the people who were so kind and lovely, people who are part of the African diaspora. Congo Square right there in New Orleans. The drum was central to that society. We forgot that this was Africa in America. That's why they were forgotten in the waters. And when the waters came and the winds blew, these people were forgotten. But they had been forgotten long before those winds and rains descended. And was God with them? Some people claim that God was because they held on to the promise of God to save them and to support them. And those who perished believe equally. I'm tired of people saying that God blessed me because I lived. Did God not bless the people who died? Did God curse them? What do you mean when you say that I was blessed to have money, so the people who don't have money have been cursed by God? I mean, look at the logic of your testimony. Look at the logic of your witness. What are you suggesting? What are you implying? What are you inferring? Are you suggesting that if God has blessed you, you will possess money or keep your life? And if God does not bless you, you will not have money and lose your life? Is it that simple? Maybe God is a Republican. So down in New Orleans when the waters rose, and the question was not simply, although we know we got to ask it, does George Bush care about black people? Took a rapper to say that, a nervous one at that, on television, doing this thing with a comedian who was all of a sudden tongue-tied, right? Where was all that comedic genius and eloquence in the face of real tragedy? Or was that little old rapper? Yeah, I know he's narcissistic. Yeah, I know he's self-enclosed. Want to testify. Roll up in the place looking extra fly. I understand. I ain't saying George Bush is a gold digger. He just really don't mess with no broke niggas. He's like some of us, black people. Now here, Mr. Bush and an administration, and this administration was ineptitude, it had ineptitude, it had ignorance, and it had inexperience. People who hadn't, FEMA was the head of the International Arabian Horse Society, Michael Brown. You know he had no experience. This is the soft bigotry of low expectations. This is what this is, and there's cronyism too. It's my boys, I'm gonna put them in charge. What's their qualification? They my boys. What's their certification? They my boys. What's their ability? They my boys. I want them to be there. Now, when we do it, look, we can't even get a job as a clerk without being affirmative actioned and checked out. And do we have a PhD? And are you bonded for $1 million just to work at Walmart? No, my brothers and sisters, we say, first of all, Kanye West ain't talking about George Bush, the individual. He don't even know him. He's talking about George Bush, the president, the face of the government, the institutional identity. That's the George Bush he's speaking about. And care, how do you measure care? Not in terms of whether you like me or not, but whether you are sufficiently motivated to render services in a timely fashion to vulnerable people. That's how you measure care. In that sense, George Bush didn't care about poor black people. And his administration didn't. What's their government philosophy? Limited government. Why is it that people hate the government want to run it? Why is it that people who say we want to reduce the government want to work for the government to put the government out of business? Why is it that we buy that philosophy so easily? While they've expanded the government, I'm almost done, expanded the government. Here they have expanded the government exponentially in terms of intervening on our lives. They snooping on us. They ain't trying to stop that. They tell us that it's only international calls. Don't y'all believe that? They checking on some local calls too. I know they tapping my, I didn't know it. So I tell them, spell my name right. It's Dyson, not Tyson. Don't be. Put my stuff in context. You know, if they look you up and put you on a list for just checking out books out the library, what you think they're gonna do to people writing the books in the library that's getting checked out? So you know they snooping. They snooped on Dr. King. That's what Jimmy Carter said at Coretta Scott King's funeral. That's what he said. It was wrong, it was problematic, it was fundamentally distorted, and it was evil in a fundamental practice of politics. So that's all Kanye West was talking about. If he didn't, that's what I mean by it. Finally, my brothers and sisters, when we look at the context here, Isaiah says that when you pass through the waters, I'll be with you. And then he said, when they shall not overwhelm you, when you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. And yet, we have to ask the question, what does that mean in light of the people who lost their lives? Reality is that some people said God caused Hurricane Katrina. I was preaching at Abyssinian Church about a month ago, and in line signing books, a little 5-year-old boy who was a survivor of the hurricane. 5 years old, Dean Crawford. Dean Richardson, he was 5 years old, and he came up to me and he said, did God cause the storm to hurt us like they say on TV? What answer can I give this 5-year-old boy? Yes, God works in mysterious ways, God's wonders to perform. He plants his footstep on the sea and rides upon the storm. When his mama and daddy are dead, when his relatives are wiped out. Oh, that sounds good when you're singing it, but tell somebody who's been victimized by the storm and the waters have drowned them. Read Isaiah in the midst of that community. So I'm trying to struggle with what that means. I said, no, baby, God didn't cause the storm, although God can cause good to come out the storm. That even sounded like a false confession, like a cheap theological offering to a child whose unbridled belief in the word itself was so apparent, and yet the word by its interpreters had failed him. The question is not simply, do you believe in God, but does God believe in you too? It's a reciprocal relationship. If God talks about a covenant, it's not a contract. That's a reciprocal relationship predicated upon intimate engagement. If you ain't got enough faith, you really can't go there. Right? Most of us ain't got it. I confess. Most of us ain't got it. I struggle with it, trying to even get to the first level of that. But then I said to this young man, no, God did not cause the hurt and the pain. And didn't we get rid of that like in the ancient world? When everything we couldn't explain was said to be God. Ain't that some ancient stuff that's kind of leftovers? Before the reason and enlightenment came along, I ain't altar bound to reason and enlightenment, because reason and enlightenment have been instruments of colonialism and slavery. I ain't trying to worship no altar of enlightenment, but dadgummit, you gonna tell people everything you can't explain is God? Everything that is problematic that you can't put your mind on is God? I mean, what is that? What it is then is that we've got to grapple with what we understand God to be. If you think God is all powerful and God is all loving and evil exists, you got to wrestle with the contradiction. Either God ain't all good and ain't for you, or God ain't got all the power. I'm just saying. I'm just saying, when you think about that syllogism that supports the logic of your faith, you got to face that question of evil and suffering. And it ain't just a philosophical conundrum to be adjudicated by competing claims of philosophical minds. That's something you got to work out in your soul. That's something you got to work out. And so when I look at Katrina, when people say God wiped it out, I can't stand with a God like that, because if you did it on earth, they put you in jail. If you killed your children to prove a point, they call you crazy. So you telling me God can do it and God ain't? I don't know. I know we talk about Isaac and Abraham. Oh, that's tight. And we figure, but if it was anybody but God, it'd be a tough sell. Right? Because people kill their children every day thinking God told them to do it. And we think they're crazy. There are people who hurt prophets because God told them to. I've had death threats from people telling me that God told them to do it. So how you gonna trust that? If God caused Katrina to kill gay people, God's got bad eyesight. What about San Francisco? I mean, my God, man, if you're gonna get more bang for your buck, you gotta holler at where the people are. If you're gonna wipe out black people who are addicted, right, who are poor and you can't go to poor black people in New Orleans. You got to, Oakland, D.C., Anacostia, Detroit. How you gonna start with New Orleans? God wiped them out because of abortion clinics. What? Has God been to New York City? What's wrong with God? No, what's wrong with your conception of God? J.B. Phillips said, your God is too small. It ain't God that's messing up, it's your God that's messing up. See what I'm saying? Not God, your God. Not spirit, your spirit. And then when you begin to back that up, you say, well, hold on now. God wants to destroy stuff. When I read the Bible, God always offered either a Chevrolet or a whale to get out. An ark, something. I'm going to warn you, it's messed up. The flood's coming. Get on board. Even before you get turned to salt, you was on your way out of town. So all of us trying to blame God. We're trying to make God Dirty Harry. Trying to make God a backer of our spleenful bigotry. That's why I argue with these people. I'm going to sit myself down. I argue with these people on Friday, mad at me. Why are you bringing their stuff? Talking about gay people in our stuff. I said, do you know some black people are gay? Talking about they stuff. If you're black and gay, that's your stuff. Right? They didn't have no exemption from you. But they said they didn't die down there because they were gay. They died because they were black. Point taken. But some black gay people still drowned. You don't know. So why is it that we're so obsessed with gay and lesbian people? We need a black version of Brokeback Mountain. I don't know, maybe it'll be a black minister preaching against homosexuality, saying what a sin it is, leading marches against being gay, and then be found out to be gay himself. Maybe fagalicious. Maybe we could call it that. If God is God and God is God for all of us, there are no asterisks. That's why God is with us in the water and the fire. Because God is with us in the water and fire by giving us the assurance that whatever it is that we confront, whether on this side of the world or the next, whether in this life or the next, that God will not leave us alone. There is no guarantee of outcome. This blessing theology is a manipulation of the relationship between means and ends. There is no guarantee of the outcome. There is a guarantee of the indwelling. That's the difference it makes. It don't mean that you ain't got to die. Don't mean that you ain't got to drown. Don't mean that you ain't got to burn. It means you ain't doing it by yourself. In fact, God did it first. Came down here and suffered with you because God suffered for you so that God would not allow others to suffer by themselves. That's what you and I have to do, come hell or high water. God bless you.